Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Schulenberg, Clinical Consultant for the Asia region with Pearson Clinical Assessment. And today we'll be hearing from a panel of clinicians in the U.S. and Dr. Susie Raiford, who is our Wechsler Research Director at Pearson, about different clinicians' experiences with administering the Wechsler product, specifically the WAIS-IV, the WASI-II, and the WISC-V remotely over telehealth. And there are some really common questions that come from clinicians trying to use these assessments in telehealth. So we thought it would be great to hear directly from clinicians who have had this experience, as well as Susie, who's the one of the main experts in the world about these products, about how clinicians all over the world could be using these assessments efficiently over telehealth. As all of our participants on the recording today are from the United States, this was pre-recorded. However, I am available live through the Q&A panel if you have any questions. And if there's any questions that I'm not able to answer, I will pass them along to Susie, and she can answer them for me over email. Just a few housekeeping notes. In the Documents panel, you will find a troubleshooting guide for the webinar platform. However, if you just refresh your browser, that should resolve any audio or video problems you might be having. There is also a document you can download, which is the handouts for today. And please do put your questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll try to get them answered live, and if not, again, over email. This webinar is being recorded, so you can revisit it anytime using the same link you used to join today. Okay, and without further ado, let's get started with today's webinar.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to our webcast on administering the WAIS-IV and WISC-V remotely. What can I learn and how? The Neurocognitive Center of Excellence at Pearson has invited several of our Pearson clinicians to speak with Wechsler Research Director Susie Raiford today about some common questions that we are hearing with regard to administering the WAIS-IV and WISC-V remotely. We have a panel of clinicians with us today who are here to ask some questions of Susie. We have Pat Moran, Lindsay Simas, Anne-Marie Kimball, Kathleen Woodward, Maggie Chair, Liz Gross, and Gloria McCoo. And we have, of course, Dr. Susie Raiford, our Wechsler Research Director. So thank you, Susie, and let me have Dr. Pat Moran ask the first question.
Thank you for your time, Susie. So one of the first questions that has been brought up by folks who are doing testing, particularly with the WAIS, is what can I do if I can't administer block design?
Mm-hmm. So it's not surprising we're hearing that question a lot, because we've learned that many people who are using the WAIS and the WISC are assessing directly into the examinee's home. So although some people are bringing people in and doing a clean room assessment in their offices, many times it is direct to home. So I'm really glad that this question came up and we can talk about this. So for the WAIS-IV, we do have some flexibility in the full scale IQ and in our composite scores to do things like substitute or prorate. And in this case, if you're not going to be able to use block design, you would give all of your core 9 subtests that you typically give. So similarities, vocabulary, information, visual puzzles, matrix reasoning, digit span, arithmetic, coding, and symbol search. So that's all the 9 core subtests other than block design. And you would choose to substitute for block design using figure weights or picture completion, or you could prorate. And that can be done on the perceptual reasoning index as well as on the full scale IQ. You can use substitution or proration on either one. And as well as on the general ability index. You can also substitute figure weights or picture completion for block design. So here you'll still get your full scale IQ, and if you wish, your GAI along with all of the other 4 index scores. Does that help?
Thank you. And with the next question is Lindsay Simas.
Hi, Susie. Thanks so much for being here today. Just piggyback on what Pat had asked, I'm curious what I can do if I can't use block design or response booklets.
Okay, so we're going to do something similar, but we're going to have a couple of composite scores that we can't obtain in this situation. So on the perceptual reasoning index, we can still substitute figure weights or picture completion for block design, or we can prorate on the perceptual reasoning index. We can still obtain our VCI and our WMI, but we would not be able to obtain the processing speed index because we're not going to give coding or symbol search. And we would not be able to obtain the full scale IQ because if you don't have any processing speed subtest, then you're not able to calculate it. However, if you want a kind of a more of a global measure, you can use the general ability index and substitute. So for this battery, you would give all of your core 7 subtests other than block design, coding, and symbol search. So similarities, vocabulary, information, visual puzzles, matrix reasoning, digit span, and arithmetic are the 7 out of the core subtests that you would use. And then you would choose figure weights or picture completion to substitute for block design or prorate. And here you will get a GAI, if you wish, along with 3 index scores, the VCI, the PRI, and the WMI.
Thank you.
Thank you. Susie, I've got the next question. This is Anne Marie. What materials would I need if I wanted to do this?
Sure. So there are materials available that are digital that you would need, and you'll need all of the WAIS-IV STEM books. There's 2 of them, the stimulus books that are digital on Q Global. You would need a manual, administration scoring manual, either your paper copy or your you can purchase a digital administration scoring manual on Q Global as well. You will need a paper record form. So Q Global doesn't have something on there that allows you to administer and score digitally. You can administer using the STEM books, but there's not something that you would mark up or click or anything like that. So you still need your paper record form. And then the paper response booklet, if you're going to be giving coding and symbol search, we recommend having one of those in each location for the examiner and for the examinee. In addition, you could also use your Q Interactive WAIS-IV subscription and use mirroring software to mirror the examinee's iPad onto your screen, and then use screen sharing to show that content to them. So if you already have a subscription to Q Interactive, you can administer it through telepractice as well. If you use that mirroring software, there's no need to double purchase. And then if you're wanting to calculate a general ability index, you'll need that table, which is there's a norms table in the WAIS-IV Technical and Interpretive Manual in Appendix B. And back when we did the WAIS-IV, this was the first time that we placed the general ability index in the actual manuals. So we had it in the technical manual. So you'll need to check for it there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We have Kathleen Woodward with our next question.
Hi, Susie. We have been discussing the WAIS-IV, but can you let us know what it would look like to administer the WISC-V without block design?
Sure. So if you remember on the WAIS-IV, there's 10 core subtests that go into the full scale IQ, and the WISC is a little different because we switched over to the 5-factor model, whereas the WAIS-IV was the 4-factor model. So when those composite scores were calculated, there's some different choices that need to be made in terms of how much substitution and proration is allowed. So it is somewhat different than the WAIS-IV, the WISC-V scenario. Without block design, we cannot calculate our visual spatial index. So I wanted to address that first and what we could do about that. But we can still calculate our full scale IQ, and that's just by using either visual puzzles and substituting that in for block design, or you can prorate. So let me show you the visual spatial index option that's available to you. So this is the published WISC-V visual spatial index. Block design and visual puzzles contribute to that. And in my book, Essentials of WISC-V Integrated Assessment, I actually calculated and provided a non-motor visual spatial index based on block design multiple choice and visual puzzles. Block design multiple choice is a subtest in the WISC-V Integrated, which is an expanded clinical battery that can help you learn more about your WISC-V results. And this is one useful application. So if you administer that block design multiple choice subtest, there's no blocks involved. It's just on screen in a stimulus book, much like visual puzzles. So you can obtain some information about the child's visual spatial processing ability on a different task than visual puzzles, but that does not involve blocks. So if blocks aren't practical, this is a way to get at that same ability. So in this scenario, you're not going to be using block design. So you're going to replace that non-motor visual spatial index using block design multiple choice instead of block design with visual puzzles. And then you can substitute visual puzzles for block design in calculating your full scale IQ. But you can see the other composite scores can still be obtained. Those aren't affected. Many of the ancillary composite scores can still be obtained. And then I'm going to talk about this a little bit more on the next option, but there is a non-motor nonverbal index and a non-motor general ability index that can be calculated with block design multiple choice. So we have to have the right components from the WISC-V integrated, and we're going to be going over that a little later, exactly what's needed to be able to use this battery. But other than using block design multiple choice, you're really just using the same primary subtests to get your 5 index scores and your full scale score. So the same 10 subtests minus block design, so you have 9, and then adding block design multiple choice. So a total of 10 subtests will give you all of this. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Susie. We have Maggie Chair with the next question.
Thank you, Emily. Hi, Susie.
Hey.
To expand on Kathleen's question, what can I do if I can't use block design or response booklets with WISC-V remotely? What would that battery look like?
Sure. So in this situation, you're really going to be dropping out coding and symbol search, right? And then you're still not going to be using block design. So then out of your 10 primary subtests, you're still administering 7 of them, but we are going to augment this battery with a couple of additional measures that can help fill out the composite scores that you can obtain. So I just wanted to show this because I'm going to be talking about a non-motor full scale score and then where to obtain the information about that score, as well as the other non-motor scores I've been mentioning. So this is the published WISC-V full scale IQ. You can see that block design is involved in this score, of course, and then we have to administer coding. So if we don't have these 2 subtests, the full scale IQ is restricted to only 1 substitution or 1 proration. And we did that for the purposes of limiting measurement error, that with a full scale IQ that's got 7 subtests, if you're missing 2, there was just too much measurement error introduced. So there is an option, though, that we can use, and that's this non-motor full scale score So for the non-motor full-scale score, you use the same 5 subtests that you're not eliminating, that you always use for the full-scale IQ, but you use block design multiple choice instead of block design, and naming speed quantity instead of coding. So here, instead of block design, it's going to be block design multiple choice. Instead of coding, it's going to be naming speed quantity. So the naming speed quantity score is converted for you from a standard to a scaled score automatically in an Excel tool that's available for free on the Pearson Q Global site. And there are sometimes questions about why was naming speed quantity chosen to represent processing speed, because that's not something that we talked about in the main version of the WISC. But subsequently in the Essentials of WISC-V Integrated Assessment, this is discussed extensively, and there's a great deal of validity and clinical utility and reliability evidence to support this alternate score, this non-motor full-scale score. So the reason that naming speed quantity, I just want to go into detail a little bit about that, although all of this information is available in that free book excerpt that's on Q Global. The reason it was chosen to represent processing speed and to replace coding for this new score is that they each involve cognitive speed and visual scanning and associative memory. But there are some differences. So on the surface, coding involves visual associative memory and coding and rapidly using newly encoded associations and motor production, whereas naming speed quantity involves auditory visual associative memory and rapid retrieval of frequently used long-term associative memory and expressive responses. Interestingly, though, both do involve verbal automaticity of retrieval in response to quantitative stimuli. Coding has an auditory visual associative memory component in the numbers. So those who have more strongly automatized the names of the digits have an advantage because they can verbally mediate the task as they fill in the codes. But for naming speed quantity, it's retrieving the names of those digits in response to an abstract quantitative representation, which is likely an earlier skill than automaticity of numbers. And you can see that anytime you look at a kindergartner's homework, where they're having to name quantities as fast as possible. Those tasks are called subitizing tasks. And relative to naming speed literacy, which would have been the other selection that we could have chosen, naming speed quantity has reduced language requirements. Additionally, it's got clinical sensitivity similar to coding for many neurodevelopmental conditions that are commonly assessed with the WISC-V, including intellectual disability, specific learning disorder, ADHD, autism, and traumatic brain injury. And naming speed quantity also has a superior G loading relative to naming speed literacy. And the data related to this analysis is also available in that Essentials of WISC-V Integrated Assessment excerpt that's available for free for you on Q Global. And it also has a higher loading on the processing speed factor than does cancellation. So that's why naming speed quantity was chosen for this score. Now I want to emphasize these new scores do not involve substitution or proration. These are new norms that were calculated using the Pearson norming method. So it's not introducing additional measurement error. And the book is provided so that you'll have access to all the validity, construct validity, and clinical utility evidence about these new scores. In addition, let's say that you decide you want to use the nonverbal index, that's going to be necessary for a particular child. This is the typical nonverbal index that we provided in the manual for the WISC-V. There's a non-motor nonverbal index. So that also involves block design multiple choice in place of block design. And then the one subtest we drop out is coding, because since it's non-motor and we don't want to use, we're not going to use response booklets in that situation, we don't have coding in here. And since it's nonverbal, we didn't put naming, speed, quantity in there either. This is the general ability index that's available in the published WISC-V. This is just the FSIQ subtests without the working memory and processing speed subtests involved. And then this is the non-motor parallel score that's available with block design multiple choice. So there's a lot of options for any type of global ability score you might want to be looking at or might need for different clinical situations. A lot of flexibility because there's this complement of these other scores. So getting back to your question, I got a little off topic there, but I thought the background was necessary because these scores are different. So in this situation, we're not going to use blocks, we're not going to use response booklets. We're going to do the same thing on the visual spatial index as we did before. We're going to replace the non-motor visual spatial index using block design multiple choice instead of block design. Then processing speed, we can't obtain that score, but we do have a measure of cognitive speed available in the battery, and that's the naming speed index. It's a complementary index score. It's always been there. It's there in the WISC-V. So that's a great alternative that's available to round out your scores. For the full-scale IQ, we're going to replace that with the non-motor full-scale score. Again, remember, this is not substitution or proration. It's a different norm, but it's very highly associated with the full-scale IQ, and you can read all about it in that free book excerpt and judge for yourself. Then for that score, you're going to be using block design multiple choice and naming speed quantity instead of block design and the processing speed tasks. Again, you can get all of these ancillary index scores, no problem, no changes. But then when you get to the nonverbal index and the GAI, you've got those options that I discussed earlier. The one score you can't get is the cognitive proficiency index. So for this, you're really doing the same thing that you did when there were no blocks, but you're also administering the 2 naming speed subtests. And you're leaving out the processing speed subtests, coding and symbol search. So does that help?
Yes, in fact, Susie, I just want to point out, the rationale you provided for using naming speed quantity was so thorough. I really appreciate that, as well as that, the task demands analysis has never been more relevant to our practice, especially for school psychologists.
Yes, thank you very much, Susie. And with our next question is Liz Gross.
Hi, Susie. Yeah, this is very helpful. I'm wondering what materials would I need to do this?
Sure. Well, we've got a handy dandy list here for you. So remember, for block design multiple choice, you're going to be accessing some of the WISC-V integrated components and some of the components related to the Essentials of WISC-V integrated book I've been mentioning. Again, this is not being sold, where this is available for free on Q Global, and so is the interpretive assistant. These two pieces kind of go together. They're companion pieces, and that's where you find all the information about those non-motor scores. Now, to administer block design multiple choice, in addition to having our WISC-V digital STEM book, we have to have those WISC-V digital stimulus books. There's 3 of them that you're going to need that are available for purchase on Q Global. Then you also will need the WISC-V integrated stimulus book 2, and that's because that's where the block design multiple choice stimuli are. There's a record form that's just a 1-page record form, and it's printable as many times as you need it to be printed for block design multiple choice. And I think it's a very low price. It's probably under $2. And once you buy it, you have it, and you can print it as many times as you need to. And it's really just to allow you to administer and score block design multiple choice. Then the WISC-V integrated administration and scoring manual you'll also need. That's available on Q Global if you want the digital version. You can also use your paper manual as long as you have access to it. And then the WISC-V integrated administration and scoring manual is also necessary. There's been a little bit of confusion from some folks about where the norms are for block design multiple choice. Those are in the WISC-V Integrated Administration and Scoring Manual in Table A1, which is set up just like your WISC-V Administration and Scoring Manual. Table A1 is where the subtest norms are. The subtest norms are not in my book, and that's because they were published with the integrated, of course. So if you want to use the block design multiple choice subtest norms, you need this. You also need this administration scoring manual for the instructions, because all of the instructions and how to administer it are available in that manual. And that would cover it.
Thank you. We have one question to kind of wrap up some of this, and that is, will be asked by Dr. Gloria McCoog.
Hey, Susie. My question is about validity. What evidence for validity is there for the scores that I obtain with a remote administration?
That's a very good question, Gloria, and I have a lot to say about that. I've pulled in a couple of examples as well, but really, when you think about the validity evidence, we're going to be accessing existing studies that have been conducted on a wide variety of measures. So there are over 20 studies that have examined the equivalence of performance-based tests in a telepractice versus a face-to-face mode of administration. And those studies have covered a wide variety of ages, a number of different clinical conditions, and so many different types of tasks. So when we're going to begin doing remote assessment, we need to access that information so that we can understand what does that equivalence evidence say about my scores, and how would I change my interpretation, if at all, to understand did that mode result in the same scores that I would have received or the person would have received regardless of mode when they're in telepractice or in face-to-face. So it's important to think that through because you do have a responsibility as a test user to understand that validity and be able to use it for interpretation. So I'm going to walk you through how to do that. When you're considering teleassessment, the first step is to conduct a demands analysis of each task you'll be using. So then you can look at what evidence supports tasks like the one you're considering using. And Pearson has done the work for our customers on our tests that are available for teleassessment, and that information or that homework that we've done is in Table 2 in our online guidance documents. So anytime you go to, let's say you type in WISC-V telepractice and you go to that page, if you click on Table 2, you'll see this input and output demands analysis and what studies support each task. So I'm going to walk you through how that happens and the process that we go through when they're developing those. The input and output demands really are the most critical, and I'm going to explain why. But the input is how is information received for a particular task by the examinee, and then how does the examinee provide a response. Information processing demands analysis also involves thinking about the actual cognitive process. But because of all the information that's made available in these guidance documents, these telepractice guidance documents, the processing shouldn't be different in teleassessment if done properly. So if you're doing a test of numerical operations, for example, it shouldn't be different in teleassessment if you do it right than if it is in person. So, but typically when you're analyzing the processing demands, you think about what abilities are needed to process the information, what pre-existing knowledge is necessary, And are there strategies involved in processing the information or formulating a response? So I'm going to give some examples of how the Pearson telepractice guidance guides you to ensure that these are the same when you're in a teleassessment mode as they are in face-to-face. So in terms of abilities that are needed to process the information, a barrier could be technology. So you want to make sure that technology is not interfering with the person's ability to express what they know or what their true ability is in that area. So it's important here, for example, to monitor technology issues and interpret or don't interpret your score accordingly. Like if you're administering a digit span task, for example, and the technology glitches or the audio glitches, it's important to know how that impacted your interpretation and then interpret that score or don't accordingly. Because if it's a technology glitch that caused them not to be able to hear rather than attention or concentration or working memory being involved, that's not what you're trying to measure. In terms of pre-existing knowledge that's necessary, let's stay on the digit span example. So imagine that you're administering digit span and the person is writing down the numbers as you say them. That's kind of interfering. That could be a strategy in formulating a response. So that's really a strategy, but it's not one that we want to be measuring. We don't want to measure their ability to write down the numbers as fast as you say them. So we don't allow note-taking or others in the room helping as a strategy any more than we would in a face-to-face session. Another example of a strategy might be opening up the response booklet before it's time, like before the session, and kind of looking at coding and trying to figure out what it is that you're going to be doing. Face-to-face, they're not able to do that. So if they do it in a teleassessment environment and don't wait to open that response booklet until it's time, then that's measuring something we don't want to measure. I'm going to give an example of an item just to get us into the idea of analyzing input and output demands, just to give us an example. So this is just an item I made up that's very timely, of course, because we're talking about masks. So Bill has 3 masks and 2 children. How many masks are left over if each child wears 1? So for our arithmetic subtest, for this task, the child is solving arithmetic word problems read aloud and providing a verbal response. So the input is spoken by the examiner. They're getting auditory input, and it involves attention and concentration to be able to get that input. And then the output is brief expressive responses. The processing is all listed here. But as I said, that's not really what you need to focus on when you're thinking about applying the equivalence evidence, because this should all be the same as it is in face-to-face. So this is just a little snippet of that table 2 that I mentioned earlier that's in our telepractice guidance documents. And this table goes through and lists the input and the output demands of all the subtests. This is WISC-V that I stuck in here, but we've got this for many, many different performance-based measures on the appropriate web pages for these products. So for the WISC-V, let's start with just similarities. We know that we get brief directions, the keys down here for what these stand for. These are just abbreviations, but brief spoken directions from the examiner and spoken stimuli, because the items are all spoken to tell the examinee what they're needing to do. And then the output is an open-ended spoken response. So then if we go look at the telepractice studies that are available, which are listed in the reference section for each one of the guidance documents. We didn't put the full reference here, but we can see there are 3 studies that support similarities, the equivalence of similarities in face-to-face or teleassessment. And then there's a number of digital studies also that have been done to look at the equivalence of similarities in a digital environment versus a traditional paper format. We included these because although they were not conducted remotely, these studies do involve the use of technology in assessment, and many have been concerned about how would the use of technology affect my examinee. So you can look at those as well. And then in this last column, we provided the evidence for similar tasks. So tasks that have the same input and output demands and what those references are. So here you can see there's a number of studies that have examined vocabulary, which is very similar to similarities, has the same input and output demands, as well as a number of measures from other tests that have been studied. And similarly, this is a row for matrix reasoning. We have a row for every subtest that walks through this same process. So as you're reviewing the evidence for equivalence, you're looking to inform appropriateness and your interpretation. And the question being answered is, does this evidence indicate score equivalence across modes? And on average, would a person obtain the same score with both modes? And if the evidence indicates yes, you should be able to use the same norms. You should be able to apply the reliability and validity evidence from the existing measure. But if there are studies that indicate that there is an effect, that's different than if it says if the research indicates there's no effect on scores of that type. A new study probably isn't necessary in that case. There have been some studies, not on these particular tasks that I've been talking about, but some studies that have indicated small effects, and then sometimes a second study indicates that there is no effect. So upon closer examination, that effect washes out. So it's just important to be able to know what that evidence says and understand it to support your interpretation. And I think that should cover the question, Gloria.
Yes, thank you. Very helpful.
Thank you so much, Susie, for your time today and for the work that you and the other researchers on the R&D teams at Pearson have conducted this spring, and always, but this spring around these remote assessment questions. We really appreciate it. For you in the audience, this is a link to the telepractice page, and then also a link to the Pearson Assessments general page, the Professional Assessments general page. We hope this has been helpful for you. Again, Susie, thank you. Panelists, thank you. We appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you found the information useful, and hopefully it demystifies a little bit about using some of these assessments over telehealth. My contact details are there on the screen. If you have any additional questions about telehealth or these Wechsler products or any of our assessments, please feel free to get in touch with me over email or WhatsApp. And that's it for today. Hope everybody has a great day.